Here's a psychology fact you're not ready for. Most older men don't stop dating because they want to be alone. They stop because their brain has been quietly building a wall, one rejection at a time, until the idea of trying again triggers the same response as touching a hot stove. Psychologists call this rejection avoidance calcification. And once it sets in, it doesn't just kill your dating life. It kills your ability to connect with anyone. I watched it happen to my father. He was the kind of man who used to light up a room. Funny, generous, the first one to introduce himself to a stranger. After my mother left, he went on a few dates. I remember one in particular. He came home early, didn't say much, just sat in his chair and turned on the TV. He never talked about dating again. Not once. For 15 years. I used to think he was just stubborn, that he'd given up because he was too proud. That was the most painful lie I ever believed. Because the research says my father wasn't being stubborn. His brain was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Protecting him from a threat it had cataloged as genuinely dangerous. And the mechanism behind it is not what you think. It's not bitterness. It's not ego. It's a specific, measurable neurological process that gets stronger with every passing year. And if you're a man over 50 who's told himself he's done with all that, you need to hear what's actually happening inside your head, because understanding the mechanism is the first step to deciding whether that wall is protecting you or imprisoning you. Today, I'm going to walk you through the psychology behind why this happens, the 5 hidden mechanisms that turn rejection from a temporary sting into a permanent shutdown. And more importantly, I'll show you the reversal step for each one. Because choosing to be alone should be a choice, not a sentence your brain handed down without your permission. Let's start with the one that builds the entire prison. 1. The rejection stack effect. Here's something that nobody talks about, and it changed everything for me when I finally understood it. When you're 25 and you get rejected, your brain processes it as a single event. It hurts. You recover. You move on. The emotional memory fades within weeks because your brain has a massive buffer of future possibilities to offset the pain. There's always another chance. Always tomorrow. But here's what happens as the years pass. Each rejection doesn't replace the last one. It stacks on top of it. Neuroscientists studying emotional memory have found that the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, doesn't delete old rejection memories. It archives them. And every new rejection doesn't just activate the pain of that single moment. It reactivates the entire archive. Every awkward silence. Every unreturned phone call. Every time someone looked at you and decided you weren't enough. By the time a man reaches 50 or 60, he's not responding to one rejection. He's responding to a lifetime of them firing simultaneously. Researchers at the University of Michigan found that social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula. The same neural circuitry. And here's the brutal part. Unlike physical pain, which the brain learns to downregulate over time, emotional rejection pain actually sensitizes. It gets worse with repetition, not better. This is the rejection stack effect. And it explains why a man who handled rejection at 30 with a shrug now feels it at 60 like a punch to the chest. His brain isn't overreacting. It's doing math, adding up every stored rejection and presenting the sum total as a single overwhelming threat. Me watching my father avoid every social situation where he might be evaluated by a woman, I used to think it was a choice. It wasn't. It was his amygdala doing exactly what evolution designed it to do. Keep him away from a threat that had been cataloged as real, repeated, and increasing in severity. The reversal step for this one is deceptively simple but psychologically powerful. Cognitive behavioral therapists call it rejection memory decoupling. It means consciously separating the current moment from the archive. When you feel that wave of dread before a social interaction, you name it. This is the stack talking. This is not one rejection. This is 40 years of them firing at once. But right now, in this moment, nothing has happened yet. That conscious distinction between the archive and the present is the first crack in the wall. But here's where it gets deeper. 2. Approach anxiety calcification. You've probably heard the term approach anxiety. It's that nervous feeling before you talk to someone you're attracted to. 20, it's a flutter. 30, it's a knot. 50, it's a concrete wall. And here's why it changes. Approach anxiety in younger men is situational. It spikes before the interaction and drops once you're in the conversation. Your nervous system recovers quickly because the prefrontal cortex, the brain's rational center, is strong enough to override the fear signal with logic. The worst that can happen is she says no. But as men age, something shifts. The prefrontal cortex naturally loses some of its processing speed. Not dramatically, but enough. And at the same time, the amygdala, which has been stacking rejection memories for decades, gets faster and louder. The balance tips. The fear signal arrives before the rational override can catch it. And it doesn't present as nervousness anymore. Presents as certainty. This is what I call approach anxiety calcification, when the anxiety hardens from a feeling into a belief. The man no longer thinks, I'm nervous about approaching. He thinks, I'm not the kind of person who does that anymore. The anxiety has calcified into identity. It's no longer something he feels. It's something he is. Me recognizing this in myself years before I should have, is what made me understand how subtle this process is. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly rewrites the story you tell about who you are. Research from Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert shows that humans are remarkably poor at distinguishing between emotional states and identity conclusions. We feel anxious and conclude we are anxious people. We feel rejected and conclude we are rejectable people. This misattribution, confusing a temporary state with a permanent trait, is the engine of calcification. And the calcification serves a purpose. If approaching someone new is part of your identity as not who I am anymore, then you never have to face the stack. The wall doesn't just protect you from rejection. It protects you from having to feel the cumulative weight of every rejection that came before. The reversal here requires what psychologists call behavioral activation, doing the thing before the feeling permits it. Not because you feel ready, because readiness is the lie the calcified brain tells to keep you safe. You don't wait until the wall comes down. You take one step while it's still standing. One conversation. One moment of exposure. Not to succeed, just to prove to the amygdala that the threat it's been guarding against isn't lethal. Now, pay attention because this next one hits hard. 3. Identity foreclosure. Erik Erikson, the developmental psychologist who mapped the stages of human identity, identified a concept called identity foreclosure. It originally described adolescents who adopted an identity without exploring alternatives. They became what they were told to be, not what they chose to be. But here's what nobody applies to older men, and it's the missing piece of this entire puzzle. Identity foreclosure doesn't just happen in youth. It happens again in late adulthood, and it's far more dangerous the second time around. When a man over 50 decides, I'm done with relationships, he's often not making a conscious, explored decision. He's foreclosing. He's adopting the identity of the man who's done, without examining whether that identity was chosen or imposed by accumulated pain. This is the part that hit me personally. I realized at one point that the story I was telling myself, I'm just better off alone, wasn't a conclusion I had reached through reflection. It was a script my rejection stack had written for me. And I had accepted it the same way a teenager accepts their parents' career choice without question because questioning it felt too threatening. Identity foreclosure in older men looks like wisdom. It sounds rational. I've been through enough. I know what I want. I want peace. But Erikson's own research suggests that true psychological integrity in late adulthood requires integration. Making sense of all your experiences, including the painful ones, not avoidance. The difference between a man who has genuinely chosen solitude and a man who has foreclosed on connection is subtle but critical. The first one is at peace with the possibility of connection and has consciously decided it's not what he needs. The second one has shut down the possibility entirely because considering it activates too much pain. One is a decision. The other is a defense mechanism wearing a decision's clothing. The reversal for identity foreclosure is the hardest of all 5. Because it requires you to question a story that feels like bedrock. Therapists call this narrative reauthoring. Instead of, I'm done with relationships, you test the alternative, I've been hurt by relationships, and I haven't yet decided what I want next. That single shift from conclusion to open question reopens the exploration that foreclosure shut down. Here's the truth I needed someone to tell me years ago. For the vulnerability paradox. This one sounds completely backwards. I know. Everything in a man's experience after 50 tells him that vulnerability is the enemy. Vulnerability is what got him hurt. Vulnerability is what left him exposed. The logical conclusion, the one the rejection stack screams, is that the safest path is to never be vulnerable again. But psychology says something that contradicts every instinct. Vulnerability researcher Brené Brown, and before you dismiss this, her work is backed by over 2 decades of data, found that the people with the strongest sense of connection and belonging are not the ones who protect themselves most effectively. They're the ones who risk vulnerability most willingly. She calls this the vulnerability paradox. The thing you need most is the thing that feels most dangerous. For older men, this paradox is amplified by a lifetime of conditioning. Men are socialized to equate vulnerability with weakness from childhood. By 60, that equation isn't just a belief. It's a neurological highway, a deeply grooved pattern that fires automatically. Vulnerability equals danger. Danger equals avoidance. Avoidance equals safety. But the research is unambiguous. The avoidance of vulnerability doesn't create safety. It creates isolation. And isolation, according to a landmark meta-analysis by Julian Holt-Lundstad at Brigham Young University, carries a mortality risk equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The wall the brain builds to protect you from rejection is, statistically, more likely to kill you than the rejection itself. Me spending years behind that wall, telling myself I was being smart, strategic, self-protective. I wasn't protecting myself. I was slowly suffocating behind a barrier I'd mistaken for a fortress. The reversal is not about becoming recklessly open. It's about calibrated vulnerability, what psychologists call titrated exposure. You share one small truth with one safe person. Not your deepest wound. Not your whole story. Just one honest sentence. I've been on my own for a while, and sometimes I wonder if I made the right call. That's it. That's enough to crack the pattern. Because the paradox works in both directions. One moment of chosen vulnerability can disrupt years of compulsive self-protection. This last one is the one that ties everything together. 5. The emotional rewiring protocol. Everything I've described so far, the stack, the calcification, the foreclosure, the paradox, they all share one root cause. The brain's threat detection system has been trained, over decades, to classify human connection as a source of danger rather than a source of reward. Neuroscientists call this a shifted reward valence. The brain literally reassigns the emotional category of intimacy from rewarding to threatening. And once that shift happens, no amount of logical argument can reverse it, because it operates below the level of conscious thought. But here's what can reverse it. The brain's neuroplasticity doesn't expire at 50, or 60, or 70. Research from the National Institute on Aging has consistently demonstrated that the human brain retains its capacity for structural change throughout the entire lifespan. The pathways that were built by decades of rejection can be remodeled by new experiences, if those experiences are consistent, small, and emotionally safe. This is the emotional rewiring protocol, and it has 3 components. First, micro-connections. Not romantic, not high stakes, just small, genuine moments of human warmth. A conversation with a barista, a phone call with an old friend, a compliment given to a stranger. Each one sends a data point to the amygdala. Connection is not always followed by pain. Second, somatic reprocessing. The body stores rejection trauma physically, in tension patterns, in posture, in the way a man holds himself when he enters a room. Practices like breathwork, progressive relaxation, or even simple stretching while consciously focusing on the physical sensations of safety begin to retrain the nervous system's baseline from guarded to regulated. Third, identity expansion. Instead of defining yourself by what you've survived, you begin defining yourself by what you're still capable of. This doesn't mean dating. It doesn't mean finding a partner. It means re-engaging with the world as someone who is open to whatever comes. Not because you need connection, but because you refuse to let your pain be the architect of your remaining years. My father never got this information. He spent his last decade behind a wall he didn't know he'd built, protecting himself from a threat that existed only in his archived memories. He wasn't stubborn. He wasn't bitter. He was a good man whose brain did exactly what it was designed to do. And nobody ever told him he had a choice. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Choosing to be alone isn't strength. if the choice was made by your amygdala instead of your conscious mind. And choosing to try again isn't weakness, if you understand exactly what you're overriding and why. The rejection that built that wall happened years ago, maybe decades ago, but you're still living behind it. And every day you spend there isn't a day of peace. It's a day of obedience to a protection system that no longer knows the difference between a genuine threat and a possibility. You don't have to date again. You don't have to find a partner. You don't have to do anything. But you owe it to yourself to make sure the life you're living was chosen by you, not engineered by pain. Because the man who consciously chooses solitude after examining the wall is free. But the man who never examines the wall at all? He's not free. He's a prisoner who's forgotten there's a door.